The Evans family hadn't taken a proper vacation in years. Life in the city was demanding. Michael's work as a civil rights attorney had only intensified recently, and Abby's career as a psychotherapist kept her busy as she supported clients facing their own daily struggles. The coastal town they'd chosen was small, quiet, and quaint, a perfect escape from the weight of their everyday lives. As they approached the town, a sense of relief washed over the family. The air carried a crisp, salty tang, mingling with the scent of pine and wildflowers that grew along the roadside. Their small rental house sat atop a grassy knoll overlooking the vast ocean. Its old shutters painted a faded shade of blue, while vines wrapped around the porch railing, suggesting stories from days long past. Abby smiled as they pulled into the gravel driveway. Already enchanted by the house's weathered charm, she reached over and squeezed Michael's hand, sensing his relief as he finally parked the car and exhaled, looking over at her with a quiet smile of his own. "Here we are," he said softly, and there was a weight to his words, as if stepping into this place was the beginning of something they all needed. Tiana, their 17-year-old daughter, hopped out, stretching and glancing around with a camera in hand. The town's stillness felt different than the city's rush she was used to, and she was eager to explore. Little Cameron, only 8, darted out of the car and ran around the yard, his laughter filling the cool afternoon air. Abby looked on fondly, glad her son's curiosity was already taking flight in this new place. Once they unpacked, the family decided to take a stroll into town. As they walked along the narrow, cobblestone streets, they marveled at the town's cozy atmosphere. Each shop had its own character. One window featured handmade pottery. Another, small bottles of lavender oil and honey. Tiana's camera clicked continuously, capturing the architecture, her family's smiles, and Cameron pointing out a flock of seagulls as they circled over the marina. Despite the quaintness around them, Michael couldn't shake an odd feeling that had settled in his chest. He glanced around, catching sight of a small group of locals outside a cafe who had stopped their conversation to watch the family as they passed. Their gazes weren't outwardly hostile, but there was a questioning, wary look that reminded Michael of places he'd been where unfamiliarity seemed unwelcome. Abby caught his eye and gave a slight, understanding nod. They'd both experienced these moments before. Moments where silent judgments and assumptions floated in the air like smoke. Abby took his hand in hers, a small act of solidarity. She didn't want the children to pick up on the unspoken tension around them. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" she said, her voice deliberately bright as she gestured toward the sea. Tiana was still snapping photos, oblivious to the glances, absorbed in her own world as she captured the unique beauty of the town. Meanwhile, Cameron was fixated on a lighthouse in the distance, tugging on Michael's arm, begging him to take a closer look. Michael smiled, taking Cameron's hand. For now, they were here to enjoy themselves, and he wanted his children to feel nothing but peace and curiosity in this new place. They made their way back to the rental house as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. In the kitchen, they quickly unpacked groceries they'd picked up and set about preparing a small family dinner. Abby arranged the table, lighting a candle and letting its soft light flicker as they sat down. For the first time in a while, everyone seemed truly relaxed. They laughed, sharing funny stories and making plans for the days ahead. Cameron wanted to build the biggest sandcastle in history, while Tiana hinted at dragging everyone out for a sunrise photoshoot. Abby and Michael exchanged a look. This was exactly what they had hoped for. Later that evening, as the kids settled down, Abby and Michael sat on the porch, letting the sound of the waves soothe them. Above, the stars blanketed the sky in a clarity rarely seen in the city, each one seeming to pulse softly in the cool, dark air. Michael felt the day's tension fade with each steady breath. "It's been a long time since we've been able to just be," he said softly, reaching for Abby's hand. She squeezed his fingers, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Let's hold on to it for as long as we can," she murmured, smiling to herself. thankful for this precious moment of peace. As the waves continued to lap against the shore, they both knew they'd entered a new world, one where they hoped for rest, togetherness, and simple joys. And while Michael still couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty from earlier, he decided to put it aside, if only for tonight. The next morning, Michael woke early, pulled by the irresistible allure of the beach just beyond the house. Stepping out into the crisp morning air, he felt a sense of freedom as he laced up his running shoes, hoping a quiet jog along the shoreline would bring a moment of peace before the day began. The air was cool, filled with the scent of salt and wild grass, and the sky above was painted with the faint pinks and oranges of dawn. As he jogged, he let his mind wander, savoring the solitude, the sound of his steps blending with the rhythm of the waves. Occasionally, he passed a few townspeople, an older man casting a fishing line, a couple walking their dog, some early risers setting up beach chairs, but their reactions felt different, subtle yet distinct. Some simply nodded, but others stared a moment too long, their expressions unreadable. He caught a muttered phrase as he passed one man, something just loud enough for him to hear. Outsider trouble. Michael forced himself to keep jogging, determined not to let it sour his morning. Yet, as he looped back to the house, the gnawing sensation from the day before grew, an unease that settled into his bones. Back at the rental, Abby and Tiana were making breakfast. The kitchen was alive with the smell of coffee and fresh fruit, and Cameron was sprawled on the living room floor, completely absorbed in a colorful puzzle. Michael took in the scene, feeling his tension ease for a moment as he watched his family's simple happiness. But Tiana, perceptive as ever, noticed something in her father's expression. "Dad, you okay?" she asked, her head tilting slightly as she observed him. He flashed a quick smile. "Of course, just a bit tired from the run." He tried to brush it off, not wanting to taint the mood. Tiana didn't look entirely convinced, but she turned back to her pancakes, letting it go for now. After breakfast, the family spent hours by the shore. Cameron constructed an ambitious sandcastle, and Tiana snapped photos of shells, waves, and her brother's proud grin as he showed off his sandy masterpiece. Abby, lounging on a beach blanket, marveled at the way each wave washed over the shore, feeling a soothing calm that city life rarely offered. As the sun began to set, casting golden hues across the water, they all sat together on the sand for an impromptu picnic. Felt perfect, a rare, uninterrupted moment of joy and togetherness, everyone's laughter mingling with the sound of the surf. But later that evening, as they made their way back to the house, an unwelcome surprise awaited them. Michael was the first to notice it, a small piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of their rental car. His steps faltered, and as he moved closer, a chill ran down his spine. He hesitated, then pulled the note from under the wiper. In thick, aggressive handwriting, it read, "People like you don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." For a moment, the words felt surreal, as though he were reading someone else's story. He stood there, frozen, his mind racing. Who would do this? Why? His heart sank as he thought back to the glances, the stares, and the muttered words he'd tried to brush off. Abby came up behind him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Michael, what is it?" she asked, her voice soft, but when she saw the note in his hand, her face fell, worry flashing in her eyes. Michael's first instinct was anger, but he kept it in check, knowing how deeply it would affect her. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice a measured calm, though a storm was brewing inside him. Abby's hand reached out to touch his arm, grounding him, reminding him to stay calm. "Let's not let this ruin our time here," she said quietly, urging him to focus on the family. She wanted to protect their children from the harsh reality they now faced. Michael nodded, taking a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the note. "You're right. We're here to enjoy ourselves. Let's keep it that way." He forced a smile, trying to shake off the anger. They agreed not to mention the note to the kids, hoping to shield them from the ugliness lurking in the shadows of this seemingly peaceful town. But as they made their way inside, Michael found it hard to shake the feeling of being watched, as if invisible eyes were waiting, scrutinizing their every move. That night, after tucking Cameron into bed and wishing Tiana a good night, Abby and Michael found themselves alone on the porch. The silence between them was heavy, neither wanting to acknowledge what the note meant but unable to ignore it. Michael's anger, which he'd tried to swallow, simmered beneath the surface. "What kind of person does something like that?" he muttered, finally breaking the silence. "We've barely been here a day." Abby looked at him, her expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "Michael, we both know that prejudice doesn't always wait for an invitation. We see it all the time. It's just different when it's our family in the crosshairs." Michael's jaw tightened. "We shouldn't have to feel this way on a family vacation. This was supposed to be a place to relax, to enjoy time with our kids." She reached over, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. "We won't let them take this from us. We'll stay strong, like we always have, together." As the night grew darker, they sat there, watching the stars. But beneath the peaceful facade of the sky, Michael felt a shift, like the beginning of a storm. He'd faced prejudice in his career, fought it with everything he had. But now, it felt personal in a way he hadn't expected, knowing his family was the target. And yet, despite the hostility, he was determined. He wouldn't let them win. Not here, and certainly not now. The sun rose bright and early the next day, bathing the coastal town in golden light. Abby was already in the kitchen, brewing coffee and laying out fruit for breakfast, while Tiana and Cameron gradually emerged from their rooms, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Everything seemed calm, and for a brief moment, the previous night's incident with the note faded to the back of Michael's mind. But as the family gathered around the small breakfast table, the subtle tension between Michael and Abby hadn't gone unnoticed. Tiana picked up on it almost immediately. She was sensitive to the nuances in her parents' moods and had noticed her mother's forced smile and her father's frequent glances toward the window, as though he was expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Her dark eyes looked directly at her father, waiting for an answer. Michael was about to reassure her when Abby spoke up, giving her daughter a warm but guarded smile. "Of course, sweetie. Just small-town life," she said, brushing it off. "You know how it is in places like this. Everyone's set in their ways." Tiana raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I mean, it just feels, I don't know, weird here." She looked from her mother to her father. "It's like people are watching us." Abby and Michael exchanged a quick glance. Tiana was sharp, and they knew she'd sensed the discomfort from the day before. Abby reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's. "Don't worry, Tiana. Every town has its quirks, and some people aren't used to seeing new faces. But we're here to enjoy ourselves, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Tiana didn't look entirely convinced, but she gave a small nod, accepting the reassurance for now. She had learned over the years to trust her parents' judgment, even when things didn't seem quite right. After breakfast, Michael suggested they take a trip to the beach, hoping a day by the water would bring some peace to the family. Cameron immediately perked up at the mention of sandcastles, and Tiana grabbed her camera, ready to capture more of the rugged coastline. The morning passed in laughter and light-hearted fun, as they dug their toes into the warm sand, splashed in the water, and let themselves relax for a little while. As noon approached, they decided to venture back into town for lunch. Walking along the narrow streets, they noticed more townspeople out and about. Tiana was once again snapping photos, capturing everything from the weathered signs to the eclectic architecture. But as they walked past a small coffee shop, the strange, almost palpable tension settled over them. A group of locals had gathered outside, talking in low voices. When they saw the Evans family approaching, the conversation seemed to pause. eyes subtly but unmistakably following them as they passed by. Michael felt the weight of each gaze, a quiet judgment radiating from every look. He could almost hear the unspoken question in the air. Who are they? And why are they here? He took a deep breath, casting a glance toward Abby, who was holding Cameron's hand tightly, her face carefully neutral. She, too, had noticed the sudden silence and the way people seemed to avoid their eyes. They continued walking, determined to ignore it. But Tiana, who had lagged a few steps behind to take a photo of the shopfront, suddenly paused, her camera hanging at her side. Michael turned back to see her staring at the group outside the coffee shop, her face a mixture of confusion and hurt. She wasn't a child anymore. She could see and feel the discomfort around them, and the cold reception was unsettling. "Come on, Tiana," Michael called, his voice gentle but firm, breaking her from her thoughts. She blinked, shook her head slightly, and joined them, the camera now clutched tightly in her hand. "Did you see how they looked at us?" she whispered as they continued down the street, her voice laced with a mix of curiosity and anger. "Like we don't belong here." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Some people make assumptions about what they don't understand. Tiana, they see something unfamiliar and react out of ignorance. But we're not here to make them comfortable. We're here to enjoy our time as a family." Tiana's expression softened, and she gave a small nod. But Michael could tell his words hadn't fully eased her hurt. The family found a small cafe with outdoor seating and decided to have lunch there, choosing a table near the edge of the terrace overlooking the street. They ordered sandwiches and iced teas, trying to ignore the occasional stares from passing locals. The food arrived, and they tried to settle into a more relaxed rhythm, laughing as Cameron told a story about a seagull stealing his sandwich. But as they ate, Michael couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that continued to build. Abby noticed it, too. Her smile had become tight, and she cast quick glances over her shoulder every now and then. The note, the stares, the whispered comments, it was all adding up, building a wall of silent hostility around them. After lunch, the family decided to head back to the rental house for a quiet afternoon, hoping to retreat from the tension of the town. As they walked down the street, Michael couldn't help but notice how a few people moved aside as they passed, almost as if creating a deliberate distance. There was no outright hostility, but the atmosphere felt heavier with each step, as though they were intruding on something sacred, something the townspeople weren't willing to share. When they finally reached the house, Abby let out a deep breath, visibly relieved to be back. She turned to Michael, her eyes filled with worry. "How are we supposed to relax when every step we take feels like we're stepping on someone's toes?" Michael put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We'll find a way," he said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "We can't let their narrow-mindedness ruin this trip." The rest of the day passed quietly. The children found distractions in games and puzzles, and Abby busied herself with a book on the porch. But Michael found it hard to focus. The incident at the coffee shop replayed in his mind, each stare and whispered word fanning the flames of frustration he was trying so hard to contain. As evening fell, he stepped out to the porch, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight. The familiar scent of the ocean filled the air, but instead of feeling calm, he felt trapped, weighed down by a town that seemed intent on reminding him and his family that they didn't belong. Abby joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. They stood in silence, watching the stars slowly emerge against the darkening sky. For a moment, Michael allowed himself to imagine the world they'd hoped to find here. A world where they could simply be a family, free from judgment, free from the quiet hostility that now felt inescapable. As the waves crashed softly against the shore, Michael knew this was just the beginning. The town had made its stance clear, and he could feel an unspoken challenge rising between them. He would not allow his family to be pushed out or made to feel small. Whatever it took, he would face the tension head-on. For his family, he would hold his ground, even if the peace he'd hoped for now seemed out of reach. The next morning, after breakfast, the family decided to spend the day hiking. They hoped the quiet beauty of nature would offer a reprieve from the uncomfortable stares and tension they felt in town. Michael knew it would be good for all of them, a chance to forget, even if only briefly, the note on the windshield and the cold reception from the locals. Cameron, thrilled at the idea of exploring, could barely sit still, and Tiana packed her camera, determined to capture more of the town's rugged natural beauty. They set out along a trail that wound through dense woods, with glimpses of the ocean visible through the trees. Abby marveled at the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting soft shadows along the path. Tiana and Cameron raced ahead, their laughter ringing out as they playfully argued over who would reach the next marker first. Michael held Abby's hand, their pace slower, as they both soaked in the peacefulness of the forest. For the first time since their arrival, they began to relax. The kids' laughter filled the woods, and Abby pointed out wildflowers and birds flitting between branches. Michael felt himself begin to unwind, letting go of the tension that had clung to him since they'd arrived. The further they walked, the more the weight lifted, and he began to believe that perhaps they could find pockets of peace here after all. But just as they reached a small clearing that offered a breathtaking view of the ocean below, the sound of footsteps caught Michael's attention. Turning, he saw two uniformed figures approaching from down the trail. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man with a steely gaze, led the way with an air of authority that felt almost heavy. Behind him was a younger officer who looked less certain, his gaze shifting from the Evans family to the ground as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Michael's heart sank, and Abby instinctively took a step closer to him, her hand tightening around his arm. Tiana stopped taking photos, lowering her camera, and Cameron looked up, sensing the change in his parents' posture. The family watched in tense silence as the officers came to a stop in front of them. "Afternoon, folks," the taller officer said, his voice polite but carrying a hard edge. "Mind telling me what you're doing up here?" Michael kept his expression neutral, though he felt a familiar frustration rising within him. "Just enjoying a family hike," he replied, his tone steady. "It's a beautiful trail." The officer gave a nod, his gaze flickering from Michael to Abby, then to the kids. His eyes lingered on Tiana's camera, then shifted to Cameron's bright, curious face before settling back on Michael. There was something cold, almost calculating, in his expression. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said slowly, crossing his arms. "Just making sure everything's in order." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "Suspicious activity? We're just here on vacation, officer." The younger officer, shifting uncomfortably beside his partner, seemed hesitant to engage. His gaze briefly met Michael's before he looked away, his body language conveying unease. But the lead officer wasn't finished. "Sure, you are," he said, his voice a shade colder. "But it's a small town, and folks around here don't take too kindly to strangers wandering around where they don't belong. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." The insinuation was clear, and Michael's jaw tightened as he fought to keep his composure. Abby's hand on his arm was a steadying presence, reminding him of the kids watching and listening intently. She looked at him, giving a small, reassuring nod, her eyes silently urging him to stay calm. "We're here for the same reason anyone else would be, to enjoy a bit of peace and nature," Michael replied, his voice firm. "There's no misunderstanding about that." The officer's eyes flashed with a hint of annoyance, but he quickly masked it, his gaze shifting briefly to the younger officer before he addressed Michael again. "Well, just make sure you stick to the main trails," he said, his tone laced with authority. "Wouldn't want to find you in any restricted areas. There's been trouble before." The younger officer, still silent, seemed to tense, his expression uncomfortable. Michael sensed a reluctance in him, as if he didn't fully agree with his partner's heavy-handed approach. But the lead officer's gaze held steady, challenging Michael, as though daring him to respond in any way that could justify further confrontation. "We understand, officer," Abby spoke up, her tone measured but firm. "We'll stick to the trail and respect any posted signs. We're just here to enjoy our time as a family." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, but he gave a curt nod. "Good to hear." He held Michael's gaze for a moment longer before stepping back, his demeanor still cold. "Enjoy the rest of your day." With that, he turned, and the younger officer followed him, casting one last, apologetic glance at the family before they disappeared back down the trail. For a moment, the Evans family stood in silence, the weight of the encounter settling heavily around them. Cameron was the first to break the silence. "Why were they so mad, Dad?" he asked, his young face scrunched in confusion. "We weren't doing anything wrong." Michael took a deep breath, his heart aching at his son's innocence. "You're right, Cam," he said gently, crouching down to look his son in the eyes. "We weren't doing anything wrong. Sometimes people make unfair assumptions, but that's their issue, not ours." Tiana's face was tense, her hands gripping her camera tightly. "They looked at us like we were criminals," she muttered, her voice edged with anger. "Just for hiking." Abby placed a calming hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I know, Tiana. I know it doesn't feel fair, and it's not, but we won't let it ruin our day." She gave her daughter a gentle squeeze. "We've got each other. That's what matters." Michael stood, looking out at the view beyond the clearing, trying to shake off the anger simmering within him. The peace he'd hoped to find today felt fractured, like glass that had cracked under pressure. But he wasn't about to let it shatter entirely. "Let's keep moving," he said, forcing a small smile. "We came here to hike, and that's exactly what we're going to do." They continued along the trail, but the carefree atmosphere was gone. The kids' laughter was subdued, and Tiana's camera remained idle in her hands. The shadows in the woods seemed darker, the silence heavier. The Evans family walked on, but the weight of that brief, tense encounter lingered, a reminder of the hostility simmering just beneath the surface of this picturesque town. As they neared the end of the trail, Michael felt a renewed sense of resolve. He couldn't control how people viewed them, but he could control how he responded. They would stand firm, unyielding, refusing to let anyone push them into fear or silence. They would face each moment, each challenge, as a family strong, dignified, and unafraid. But even as they walked back to the house, the shadows of that encounter stayed with them, casting a long, silent reminder that they were outsiders in this place. The peaceful vacation they'd hoped for felt increasingly out of reach. And as they stepped back onto the path leading to their rental, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. The next morning, Michael and Abby decided to venture into town to pick up a few more groceries and supplies. They tried to keep the mood light for the kids, discussing plans for a barbecue on the beach and laughing as Cameron listed out all the snacks he wanted to bring. Tiana listened, occasionally chiming in, but Michael could see the lingering tension in her eyes, the kind that had settled there since their encounter with the police on the trail. The family walked into the town's small, family-owned grocery store, this bell jingling as they stepped inside. The store was quaint, with shelves stocked with homemade jams, fresh produce, and baskets of local vegetables. The air was heavy with the smell of lavender and rosemary, but something about the place felt distinctly cold. As they moved through the aisles, Abby picked out fresh bread and vegetables, and Michael added a bottle of barbecue sauce and a small selection of herbs. Tiana browsed the fruit section, examining some ripe peaches, while Cameron tugged on Abby's hand, excitedly pointing out his favorite snacks. The atmosphere should have felt cozy, but there was an unmistakable chill in the air, as though an invisible barrier separated them from the warmth of the town. Michael noticed a few other shoppers glancing their way, casting quick, furtive looks before turning back to their shopping. He tried to ignore it, reminding himself that they were just strangers to the locals, a family that had come from outside. But the feeling was hard to shake. It prickled at him like static. an uncomfortable tension that seemed to thicken with each step they took. As they moved toward the checkout counter, the store owner, an older man with graying hair and a stony expression, watched them from behind the register. His gaze was unwavering, and when Michael met his eyes, there was no warmth or friendliness there. Instead, the man's mouth was set in a tight, thin line. "Good morning," Michael offered politely as they approached, setting their items on the counter. The store owner barely nodded, his eyes moving slowly over each member of the family, sizing them up as though he were appraising something he didn't quite trust. He didn't return the greeting, instead beginning to scan their items in silence. The beeping of the scanner, the only sound in the otherwise quiet store. Abby shifted uncomfortably beside Michael, sensing the tension as clearly as he did. She kept her expression neutral, though her fingers tightened around Cameron's hand. Cameron, noticing the stiffness in his parents, looked up at his mother, confused but quiet. Michael forced himself to remain calm, offering the store owner a polite smile. "Looks like it's going to be a beautiful day. Great weather for a beach barbecue," he said, trying to ease the tension with casual conversation. The store owner glanced up, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Just visiting. Are you?" he asked, his tone flat and unfriendly. "Yes, we're staying for a few days," Michael replied, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "Just enjoying some family time." The man's eyes flickered briefly to the children, then back to Michael, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line, and he continued scanning the items without another word. Abby looked at Michael, a hint of unease in her eyes, but he gave her a reassuring nod, silently urging her to remain calm. Just as the man scanned the last item, he cleared his throat, a slight edge creeping into his tone. "Make sure you don't leave anything behind," he said pointedly, his gaze shifting to their bags. "We've had incidents lately. Can't be too careful." The insinuation hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Michael felt his jaw tighten, anger bubbling up inside him, but he forced himself to remain composed. Abby's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, her eyes narrowing as she met the man's gaze. She opened her mouth to say something, but Michael gently placed a hand on her arm, giving her a subtle shake of his head. "Don't worry," Michael replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "We're careful people." The store owner said nothing, simply handing over the receipt with a barely concealed look of suspicion. Michael took the bags, nodding politely despite the tightness in his chest, and led his family out of the store. The air outside felt cooler, a relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. But the impact of the interaction lingered. Abby let out a shaky breath as they walked down the street, her composure finally cracking. "I don't understand it, Michael," she whispered, her voice tinged with hurt and frustration. "It's like they're determined to see us as trouble, no matter what we do." Michael nodded, sharing her frustration. "I know," he said, his voice low. "It's an ugly reality, but we can't let it get to us. They want a reaction, something to justify their assumptions. We can't give them that." Tiana, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up, her voice a mixture of anger and confusion. "It's not fair, Dad. We didn't do anything wrong, and they're treating us like criminals." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and Michael felt a pang of sadness. He stopped, kneeling down to look her in the eyes. "You're right, Tiana," he said gently, his voice filled with conviction. "It's not fair, and I wish I could say that everyone treats people the way they should. But sometimes people judge without reason, out of fear or ignorance. But that doesn't mean we have to let it change who we are." Tiana nodded slowly, though the hurt in her eyes remained. Cameron, sensing the tension, held his father's hand tightly, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "We're nice, right, Dad?" he asked softly. "Why would anyone be afraid of us?" Michael's heart ached at the question, the simplicity of it piercing through the complexities of the situation. He forced a smile, ruffling Cameron's hair. Yes, Cam, we're nice, and that's what matters. We just need to remember that. As they walked back to the rental house, Michael felt the weight of the day's events settle over him. He'd spent his career fighting for justice, for equality, and yet, here he was, facing the same prejudice he worked so hard to eradicate. It was different when it was his own family, his own children, feeling the sting of discrimination. Later that evening, they set up a small barbecue on the beach, trying to focus on each other and put the day behind them. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. And for a while, laughter replaced the tension that had plagued them all day. Cameron forgot the unease, his excitement returning as he chased after seagulls. And Tiana snapped pictures of the sunset, capturing her family's smiles against the backdrop of the waves. But as they packed up to head back to the house, Michael spotted a figure watching them from a distance, a man from town, standing at the edge of the beach, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on them with a look that sent a chill down Michael's spine. He forced himself to look away, focusing instead on Abby and the kids, determined not to let the man's silent judgment ruin this rare, beautiful moment with his family. But the shadow of that watchful gaze lingered, a quiet reminder that no matter where they went in this town, they were being scrutinized, judged, and treated as unwelcome outsiders. As they walked back to the house under the dimming sky, Michael felt a renewed determination settle over him. He wouldn't let this town's prejudice drive them away. They had every right to be here, to enjoy this time as a family, and he would protect that right, no matter what. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The day after their tense experience at the grocery store, Michael and Abby decided to take the kids on a picnic at a scenic overlook a few miles outside town. They wanted a break from the prying eyes and judgmental stares, hoping that a day spent in nature would help everyone relax. Tiana had packed her camera, determined to capture the ocean views, while Cameron ran excitedly around the rental house, clutching his favorite toy truck, ready for another adventure. The drive was peaceful, with winding roads flanked by towering trees and glimpses of the ocean through breaks in the foliage. As they reached the overlook, Michael felt a sense of relief. The view was stunning, a panoramic expanse of sparkling blue waves crashing against rocky cliffs below, framed by wildflowers that seemed to sway gently in the sea breeze. They found a small grassy area shaded by trees and spread out their blanket. Unpacking sandwiches, fruit, and drinks, Tiana immediately got to work with her camera, capturing the colors of the wildflowers and the texture of the rocks against the endless blue sky. Cameron was engrossed in his imaginary world, driving his toy truck over patches of grass and small stones, narrating his own little story as he went. For the first time in days, the family's laughter filled the air, and the heaviness they'd been carrying seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of calm and togetherness. But just as they were finishing their sandwiches, the distant sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled them back to reality. Michael looked up, his heart sinking as he recognized the two patrol cars pulling into the small parking area. He could see the unmistakable figure of Officer Johnson stepping out, followed by his partner, Officer Reed, and two other officers they hadn't seen before. Johnson's posture was unmistakably authoritarian, his gaze hard as he made his way over to the family. Behind him, Reed looked as uncomfortable as ever, his eyes darting between the family and his partner with a mixture of reluctance and resignation. The two other officers hung back slightly, watching the scene unfold with curious, assessing expressions. "Afternoon, folks." Johnson greeted them, his tone dripping with condescension. "Didn't expect to find you all the way out here." He crossed his arms, looking down at Michael with a look that made it clear he was here for more than just a friendly chat. Michael rose to his feet, careful to keep his expression neutral even as anger simmered just below the surface. Abby stood beside him, her hand slipping into his, a silent reminder to stay calm for the kids' sake. Cameron looked up from his toy truck, sensing the tension, and Tiana lowered her camera, her face tight with anticipation. "Is there a problem, officers?" Michael asked, his voice steady. Johnson gave a slow, exaggerated shrug, as though he were considering Michael's question carefully. "We received a call," he said, his gaze flicking between the family members. "Someone reported some suspicious behavior around this area. Said there was a group matching your description loitering around." Michael's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to respond evenly. "We're just having a family picnic. Nothing suspicious about that." "Maybe to you," Johnson replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But in a small town like this, people tend to notice when something looks out of place." His words hung heavy in the air, an unspoken accusation. Abby stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, officer, we're just here to enjoy the view. I don't see how that could disturb anyone." Johnson's gaze shifted to her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, in a town like this, people notice outsiders, especially when they decide to wander a little too far from the main roads." Michael took a deep breath, reminding himself to keep his composure. "We're not breaking any laws," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Unless you have a reason to detain us, I think we're done here." Johnson's face darkened, his posture growing more rigid as he crossed his arms. He glanced at Reed, who stood awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. There was a beat of silence before Johnson responded, his tone carrying a sharp edge. "Watch your tone, Mr. Evans," he said, his voice lowering. "We're just trying to keep the peace here, make sure everything's as it should be. Now, if you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind if we take a look around, will you?" Michael felt a surge of anger at the blatant intrusion, but he held his ground. This wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about asserting control, about reminding them that they didn't belong. Abby's grip on his hand tightened, and he sensed the worry behind her calm exterior. She glanced over at the kids, who were watching, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. "We have every right to be here," Michael said, his voice firmer now. "And as far as I know, enjoying a family picnic doesn't qualify as suspicious behavior." Johnson's gaze flickered, a hint of frustration flashing across his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who met his authority head-on. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. "In this town, we decide what's suspicious, Mr. Evans. And right now, I'm deciding that this looks out of place." At that moment, Tiana, who had been watching with clenched fists and a defiant look in her eyes, stepped forward, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "Why are you treating us like this?" she asked, her voice loud and clear. "We haven't done anything wrong." Johnson turned to her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes before his expression hardened. "Young lady," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's best if you stay out of this and let the adults handle it." Michael felt a protective surge rise within him, and he instinctively stepped in front of Tiana, shielding her from Johnson's cold gaze. "That's enough, officer," he said, his voice laced with a quiet but unmistakable authority. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're here on vacation. If you don't have a legal reason to be here, then I suggest you leave us in peace." The other two officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the interaction was taking. Reed shifted his weight, finally looking up, his face pale but determined. "John, maybe we should just let them be," he said quietly. "They're just here with their family. It's not worth making a scene." Johnson's expression hardened as he looked at his partner, a glimmer of frustration flashing in his eyes. For a brief moment, he seemed as if he might double down, but Reed's words had softened the edge of his aggression. He glanced back at Michael, his eyes cold, but he knew he was at a disadvantage now, especially with his own partner questioning him. "Fine," Johnson muttered, his voice tight. But don't think we're not watching. Keep to the main areas. And remember, we don't take kindly to strangers pushing boundaries around here. With that, he gave a sharp nod, signaling for the other officers to follow. Reed shot a quick, apologetic look at the family before turning and walking back to the car. His shoulders slumped with what seemed like relief. Johnson lingered for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on Michael with a look that held both anger and something close to resentment, as though being forced to retreat felt like a defeat. As the officers drove away, the silence around the family felt heavy, the peaceful moment they'd created shattered by the encounter. Tiana's shoulders were tense, her fists clenched as she watched the patrol cars disappear down the road, her face pale with frustration. Abby reached out, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You were brave, Tiana," she said softly, "and you did nothing wrong. Don't ever forget that." Michael, feeling the tension in his own body begin to ease, knelt down beside Cameron, who looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. "We're okay, buddy," he murmured, giving his son a reassuring hug. "Sometimes, people make things harder than they need to be, but we're together, and that's what matters." The family packed up their picnic in silence, their spirits subdued. As they walked back to the car, Michael felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in Tiana's courage, but sadness that his family had to experience such hostility during what should have been a time of peace. Driving back to the rental house, Michael's mind raced. He knew that standing up to Johnson today would likely only escalate the situation. But he was determined to protect his family's dignity, no matter the cost. They had come to this town hoping for a respite from their busy lives, a break from the weight of their responsibilities. Instead, they had found themselves in a quiet battle against prejudice, a battle that, Michael feared, was only beginning. As the sun set over the small coastal town, casting long shadows across the road, Michael steeled himself. He would not be intimidated. He would stand firm, with Abby and the children by his side. Together, they would face whatever came next, unafraid and unbroken. That evening, as dusk settled over the coastal town, Michael sat on the porch, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The confrontation with Officer Johnson had left him rattled, not only for himself but for his entire family. He glanced inside through the warm glow of the kitchen window, watching Abby as she gently coaxed Cameron into talking about something lighthearted. Tiana sat nearby, quietly scrolling through the photos she had taken, a faint but unmistakable look of anger shadowing her face. The quiet of the evening was broken only by the steady crash of the waves, a comforting sound that felt worlds apart from the tension swirling in Michael's mind. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp salt air fill his lungs, grounding him. He knew he needed to do something, someone he could call to make sense of this growing hostility and give his family the security they deserved. And as he thought it over, he knew exactly who he needed to contact: David Freeman, an old friend from law school and now the district attorney for the county. David was a man who had made it his life's work to fight for justice, and Michael trusted him completely. Michael pulled out his phone, feeling a sense of resolve as he dialed David's number. The call rang a few times before a familiar, warm voice answered on the other end. "Michael, been a while," David greeted, his tone friendly yet laced with curiosity. "David, it's good to hear from you," Michael replied, though he couldn't keep the tension from his voice. "Listen, I wish this was just a social call, but I'm reaching out because, well, my family and I are dealing with some issues up here." David's voice shifted immediately, taking on a more serious tone. "What's going on? Where are you?" Michael took a steadying breath, explaining the events of the past few days, the cold stares, the hateful note, the tense encounter at the grocery store, and finally, the confrontation with Officer Johnson. He described Johnson's barely concealed hostility and the way the officer had practically stalked his family, eager to remind them that they were unwelcome. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Michael could almost hear David piecing together the situation, his mind working through the implications. "Michael," David finally said, his voice firm, "I'm sorry you're dealing with this, and I hate to say it, but I'm not surprised. That town has a reputation, especially with law enforcement. They've gotten away with a lot over the years because they're careful, subtle enough to avoid drawing outside attention. It's part of why I've had complaints from others about them." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "So it's not just us?" "No, you're not alone," David replied, a hint of frustration seeping into his voice. "But they're good at pushing people just enough to make them uncomfortable, to make outsiders feel like they don't belong. It's subtle, but it's there. And from what you're telling me, Officer Johnson is making it personal." Michael looked out over the darkening ocean, feeling a chill settle in his bones. "David, I don't want to put my family in the middle of a fight, but I also can't just sit back and let this happen. My kids are already feeling it." Tiana stood up to Johnson today, and Cameron's starting to ask questions I shouldn't have to answer on a family vacation. David's voice softened, his understanding evident. "I get it, Michael. I'll make some calls. Get a message to the police chief in that precinct. He needs to know that people are watching, that there are consequences if his officers don't respect civil rights." There was a pause as David weighed his next words carefully. "But, Michael, be prepared. Sometimes these warnings backfire. People like Johnson don't like being told what to do, especially when they're used to running things their way." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. "I understand, David. Thank you. Just knowing someone's in our corner means a lot." "Always," David said firmly. "And Michael, keep a close eye on things. If anything escalates, call me right away. I'll do everything I can to make sure you and your family are safe." They exchanged a few more words before Michael ended the call, feeling a mix of relief and lingering worry. He knew David's support was invaluable, a lifeline in a town that seemed determined to isolate them. But he also understood the risks, that any intervention might provoke Johnson and his colleagues further. Michael returned to the house, where Abby was quietly tidying up the kitchen. She looked up as he entered, reading the expression on his face with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years by his side. "Did you reach him?" she asked softly, setting aside a dish towel. "Yes," Michael replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "David's going to make a few calls, put some pressure on the department. He warned me that it might ruffle some feathers, though Johnson might take it as a challenge." Abby's eyes darkened, a mixture of worry and determination flashing in them. "We can't just keep hoping things will change on their own. I don't want the kids growing up afraid of standing up for themselves." "I know," Michael said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll face whatever comes our way. Together." They shared a moment of silent resolve, knowing that the road ahead might be difficult, but feeling comforted by each other's presence. Michael felt a surge of gratitude for Abby's strength, for her willingness to protect their family even when the situation felt overwhelming. The next morning, a faint tension settled over the house as the family went about their usual routine. Breakfast was quiet, everyone sensing the invisible weight that seemed to linger from the previous day. Tiana was unusually subdued, her gaze focused on her plate as though lost in thought, while Cameron fidgeted, casting nervous glances at the door. Just as they were finishing breakfast, a sudden, sharp knock on the front door startled them. Michael and Abby exchanged a quick glance, and he felt his pulse quicken as he made his way to the door. Steeling himself, he opened it to find Officers Johnson and Reed standing on the porch, their faces set in hard, unreadable expressions. Johnson's gaze was colder than ever, his posture exuding an air of authority that felt almost suffocating. Reed stood a step behind him, his face drawn with discomfort, as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Michael knew instantly that this wasn't a routine visit. This was intimidation, plain and simple. "Morning, folks," Johnson said, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Thought we'd check in, see how you're settling in." Don't want any misunderstandings. Now, do we? Michael felt the weight of Johnson's stare, the unspoken threat lingering in the air. He kept his voice steady, refusing to let Johnson see his anger. We're doing just fine, officer. Is there something specific you're here for? Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Well, it's come to our attention that certain outsiders seem to think they're above following the rules in this town. Thought I'd remind you that we don't take kindly to that. Michael took a deep breath, feeling Abby's presence just behind him, her silent support bolstering his resolve. He met Johnson's gaze, his voice calm but firm. We're here with our family, following the same rules as everyone else, and I'd appreciate it if you'd respect that. Johnson's expression hardened, a dangerous glint flashing in his eyes. Just remember, we're watching. If anything unusual happens, we'll be the first to know. With that, Johnson turned and walked back to the patrol car, Reed following with a quick, apologetic glance at the family. The two officers drove away, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Michael closed the door, feeling the weight of the encounter settle over him. He turned to find Tiana and Cameron watching him, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. He forced a reassuring smile, reaching out to ruffle Cameron's hair. They're gone now, he said gently. Let's just focus on enjoying our time together. But as they went about their day, Michael knew the tension had seeped into his family, like an invisible shadow that followed them wherever they went. The threat was real, and he understood now that Johnson wouldn't back down easily. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael sat with Abby on the porch, watching the waves crash against the shore. They didn't need words to express their shared concern. The silent understanding between them was enough. But beneath the worry, there was also a steely determination, an unspoken vow that they wouldn't let fear dictate their actions. They had come here as a family, and together, they would face whatever came next. And no matter how hard Johnson and his colleagues tried to intimidate them, Michael knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would not be driven away. Not now, and not ever. The following morning dawned gray and quiet, with clouds heavy on the horizon, casting a shadow over the small town. The tension from Officer Johnson's visit lingered like an unwelcome guest, weighing on the Evans family as they tried to go about their day. Breakfast was subdued, and even Cameron, usually bright and talkative, was quiet, his young eyes watching his parents as though seeking reassurance. After the meal, Michael pulled Abby aside in the kitchen, away from the kids' ears. He took a steadying breath, his eyes meeting hers. We need to address this openly with Tiana and Cameron, he said quietly. They can feel something is wrong, and pretending otherwise is only going to make it worse. Abby nodded, her gaze soft but determined. They're already noticing the hostility around us. Hiding the truth won't protect them. It'll only confuse them. Together, they gathered the children in the living room, where sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft, dappled patterns on the floor. Tiana sat cross-legged on the couch, her face already showing signs of worry, while Cameron perched beside her, glancing nervously between his parents. Michael took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I know things have been tense since we arrived, he began, his voice calm and steady. You've both noticed it, the looks, the things people have said, even the police checking in on us. I want you to know that none of this is because we did anything wrong. Sometimes, people make assumptions based on what they think they know about us, and that's their mistake, not ours. Tiana looked up, her eyes meeting his with a fierce intensity. So, they're treating us like this because we're different? Because they don't want us here? Abby leaned forward, her hand resting on Tiana's knee in support. Yes, honey, and I know it feels unfair, it is unfair, but sometimes, people are uncomfortable with what they don't understand. That doesn't make their behavior right, and it doesn't mean we have to put up with it. Cameron looked up at his father, his young face twisted in confusion. But, Dad, we're nice. Why would anyone be afraid of us? Michael's heart twisted at the innocence in his son's voice. He gave Cameron a reassuring smile, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. I know, buddy. Sometimes, people don't take the time to get to know others. They judge from a distance. But that's on them, not us. All we can do is be who we are, stand up for ourselves, and stay together as a family. Tiana's brow furrowed as she considered his words, her fingers clenching around the edges of her sweatshirt. So, what are we supposed to do? Just pretend it doesn't bother us? Abby exchanged a glance with Michael before answering. No, Tiana, it's okay to feel hurt or angry, but we don't let that anger control us. We use it as fuel to stand strong, to show them that we belong just as much as anyone else. We don't hide or shrink ourselves to make them comfortable. Tiana nodded, her expression hardening with determination. Then I'm with you. I don't want to leave just because they think they can push us out. Michael felt a swell of pride in his daughter's resolve, her courage mirroring his own. He looked over at Abby, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. Good, he said, his voice resolute, because we're here as a family, and together, we're stronger than any of the prejudice they can throw at us. After their conversation, they decided to spend the day at the beach, a deliberate choice to assert their presence without fear. They packed towels, snacks, and a volleyball, determined to enjoy the simple pleasure of a family day on the sand. As they walked down the narrow path to the shore, Tiana's camera slung around her neck and Cameron clutching a small bucket and shovel, they felt a renewed sense of unity, a quiet but firm resolve to reclaim their time together. At the beach, they spread out their blanket, kicking off their sandals as they settled into the warm sand. Cameron eagerly set to work building a sandcastle, his small hands scooping up wet sand, while Tiana wandered down to the waterline, capturing the view of the cliffs and waves crashing against the rocks. Abby and Michael lay back on the blanket, watching their children with a sense of peace that had been missing in the past few days. But as they relaxed, Michael noticed a familiar figure at the edge of the beach, a man he recognized from town, leaning against his truck and watching them with a dark, brooding expression. He held his gaze for a moment, not wanting to give the man the satisfaction of looking away. But inside, he felt a renewed surge of frustration. Even here, on the sand with the ocean stretching endlessly before them, they couldn't escape the shadow of scrutiny. Do you see him? Abby asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. Yes, but he's not going to ruin this for us. As the man eventually left, the family went on with their beach day, making a game of collecting shells with Cameron, playing volleyball, and laughing as Tiana challenged her parents to a photography contest. For a few hours, they managed to reclaim a sense of normalcy, each of them feeling stronger in the shared, unspoken resolve that had grown since that morning. That night, as they prepared for bed, Michael's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. David Freeman. He stepped onto the porch to take the call, his voice barely steady as he answered. David. David's voice was serious but calm. I wanted to let you know that I spoke to the police chief. I explained that there's a family on vacation who's feeling threatened by one of his officers. I made it clear that this situation needs to be handled carefully. Michael took a deep breath, letting the weight of David's words settle over him. Thank you, David. I can't tell you how much it means, knowing someone's got our back. Of course, David replied. But Michael, just be careful. The chief wasn't exactly thrilled to hear from me, and I got the impression that Johnson might be a hard case. If he senses pressure from above, he could take it as a personal challenge. Michael's jaw tightened. I understand. We'll stay vigilant, but we're not backing down. Good, David said firmly. And keep me updated. I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't escalate. They ended the call, and Michael stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind him. Abby was waiting, her expression questioning. What did he say? Michael gave her a reassuring smile. He spoke to the police chief. There's a chance this might keep Johnson in check. At least for now. Abby nodded, though her gaze was tinged with worry. And if it doesn't? Michael took her hand, squeezing it tightly. Then we keep doing what we're doing together. We're not running. And we're not letting them take this time from us. The next day, the family ventured into town once more, making a point of visiting the local coffee shop and bakery. The atmosphere was cold, the eyes of the townspeople lingering on them, but the Evans family held their heads high, refusing to let the weight of the stairs wear them down. Michael ordered coffee for himself and Abby, handing the barista a polite smile despite the lack of warmth in her gaze. Tiana and Cameron stayed close, absorbing the subtle hostility around them but standing strong, their resolve reinforced by the quiet confidence in their parents. As they left the cafe, Michael felt a surge of pride. The townspeople could stare all they wanted, could mutter and judge and try to make them feel small, but they were a family, bound together by something stronger than prejudice. And as they walked back to the car, Michael felt a sense of triumph, knowing that, in their own way, they had won a small victory simply by refusing to be intimidated. They returned to the house that evening, tired but invigorated, having faced the town's quiet hostility with unwavering dignity. And as they settled down for dinner, laughter and warmth filling the room, Michael felt a deep sense of pride. No matter what came next, they were ready, united, resilient, and unafraid to stand up for who they were. The morning dawned quietly, with a heavy mist draping over the town like a shroud. Michael had hoped the tension would dissipate after David's call to the police chief, but a sense of unease still lingered. The Evans family spent a calm morning at the rental house, enjoying breakfast together, their conversation light and filled with plans for the day. Just as they finished breakfast, Tiana suggested a return to the scenic overlook they'd visited before, and Cameron eagerly agreed, already grabbing his toy truck. Abby smiled at Michael, giving him a slight nod. It was a good idea. The overlook had become a sort of sanctuary, a place away from the prying eyes and judgment of the townspeople. The drive up the winding road was peaceful, with Abby pointing out wildflowers along the way and Cameron filling the air with stories of his toy truck's adventures. They parked near the overlook, unpacking their picnic basket and setting up a small blanket on the grass. The air was fresh and cool, carrying a faint scent of pine and salt, and for a moment, they managed to lose themselves in the beauty of the morning. As they laughed and shared stories, Tiana wandered off to capture some photos, her camera clicking as she explored the area. Cameron busied himself with his truck, driving it over small hills of grass. Michael and Abby sat back, hands clasped, feeling a rare sense of peace settle over them. But the peace was short-lived. The unmistakable sound of gravel crunching under tires shattered the quiet. Michael's heart sank as he turned to see two patrol cars pulling up. Officers Johnson and Reed stepped out of the first car, and two additional officers emerged from the second. Johnson's expression was hard, his gaze fixed on Michael with a determination that left no room for doubt. This wasn't a friendly check-in. It was something more. Johnson strode toward the family, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. Behind him, Reed looked uncomfortable, his face pale as though he'd rather be anywhere else. The two new officers stayed back, exchanging glances, unsure of what to expect. "Morning, folks," Johnson called out, his voice carrying an unmistakable edge. "Fancy seeing you all the way out here again." Michael rose to his feet, his body tense as he met Johnson's gaze. Abby joined him, her hand slipping into his for support. Tiana and Cameron noticed the shift in their parents' demeanor and stopped what they were doing, instinctively moving closer. "Is there a problem, officer?" Michael asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. Johnson crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "We got another call about some suspicious behavior," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Someone matching your description was seen loitering around private property." Michael's patience was wearing thin. We're here with our family, on public land, enjoying a peaceful morning. I don't see how that qualifies as suspicious. Johnson took a step closer, his voice lowering. You're in my town, Mr. Evans. And as far as I'm concerned, when you're here, you follow my rules. Abby gripped Michael's hand tightly, her eyes locked onto Johnson's. We're following the law, officer. We have every right to be here, just like anyone else. Johnson's face hardened, and he looked down at her with a glare that was both dismissive and threatening. Just because you think you know the law doesn't mean you're above it. Tiana, who had been listening with growing frustration, stepped forward, her voice steady but edged with anger. This is harassment, and you know it. We haven't done anything wrong. You're only here because you don't want us in your town. Johnson turned his gaze to Tiana, his face twisting with barely concealed contempt. Young lady, I suggest you keep quiet and let the adults handle this. But Tiana didn't back down. She looked Johnson in the eye, her voice unwavering. No, I won't be quiet. We deserve to be here as much as anyone else. And you know that. Michael felt a surge of pride at his daughter's courage. But he knew the situation was escalating. He stepped forward, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. That's enough, Officer Johnson, he said firmly. You've seen us. You know exactly what we're doing. If you have no legal reason to be here, then I suggest you leave. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger, and he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His tone was menacing as he spoke. You don't get to tell me what to do, Mr. Evans. I'm here to keep the peace, and I'll decide what that looks like. Before Michael could respond, another car pulled up to the overlook, and relief flooded through him as he recognized the man stepping out. David Freeman. The district attorney strode across the grass toward them, his expression unreadable but his presence carrying a weight of authority that immediately shifted the power dynamic. Officer Johnson, David called out, his tone calm but firm. What seems to be the issue here? Johnson looked taken aback, his confidence wavering for the first time. Mr. Freeman, he stammered, quickly masking his surprise. We received a call about suspicious activity. I'm just doing my job, making sure everything's in order. David raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp as he took in the scene. A family on vacation, enjoying a picnic at a public overlook. Hardly seems suspicious, especially considering the calls I've been getting about your treatment of this family over the past few days. Johnson's face turned red, his posture stiffening as he struggled to maintain control. With all due respect, Mr. Freeman, we're just trying to keep this town safe. David stepped closer, his tone lowering. I don't see how harassing a family falls under keeping this town safe, Officer Johnson. And I'd remind you that there are limits to your authority. I suggest you respect those limits. A tense silence followed, with Reed and the other officers watching the exchange, their expressions uneasy. Johnson clenched his fists, the anger in his eyes barely concealed. But David didn't back down, his calm, authoritative presence forcing Johnson to confront his actions. Finally, Johnson gave a tight nod, his voice barely more than a mutter. Fine, just remember, we'll be keeping an eye on things. With that, he motioned for the other officers to follow, his pride clearly wounded as he retreated to his patrol car. Reed gave Michael an apologetic look before turning to join his partner. The officers drove away, leaving a strained but victorious silence in their wake. David turned to the family, his expression softening as he looked at Michael. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I did what I could. But, Michael nodded, his gratitude evident. Thank you, David. I know you went out of your way to help us, and we appreciate it more than you know. David gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Your family, Michael, and no one deserves to be treated like that, especially not here. If you need anything else, you know where to find me. After David left, the family stood in silence for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Tiana looked up at her father, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and sadness. "Dad, I, I didn't mean to make things worse." Michael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle. "You didn't make things worse. Tiana, you showed courage, and I'm proud of you. Standing up for yourself is never wrong." Cameron looked up, wide-eyed, clearly trying to process everything that had just happened. "Are they going to keep bothering us?" "Dad." Michael knelt down, pulling his son into a hug. "I don't know, buddy, but no matter what happens, we're a family, and as long as we stand together, we'll be okay." The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting warm light over the overlook, as though it were trying to chase away the shadows of the confrontation. The family packed up their picnic quietly, each of them carrying a newfound sense of strength and unity. They had faced the hostility head-on and had stood their ground, refusing to let fear or intimidation divide them. As they made their way back to the car, Michael felt a sense of calm settle over him, a resilience born from the trials of the past days. They would continue their vacation, enjoy their time together, and leave this town knowing they hadn't backed down. In the end, the Evans family's strength lay in their unity, in the courage to face prejudice with dignity and resilience. And as they drove down the winding road away from the overlook, Michael knew that, no matter what lay ahead, they were ready to face it, together. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the house, filling every corner with warmth as if to mark a new beginning. The air felt lighter, as though the tension that had lingered so persistently had finally started to fade. The Evans family gathered around the breakfast table, sharing one last meal in the small rental house that had been both a sanctuary and a battleground. There was a quiet determination in the room, a silent understanding that they had faced something important together, and they had won. After breakfast, they began packing up, folding clothes, stacking books, and filling their bags with the last remnants of their stay. The house, now emptying out, felt different somehow, like a place transformed by the struggles and victories it had witnessed. Michael found himself lingering over small details, the worn patterns on the couch, the wooden table where they'd had so many conversations, and the porch where he and Abby had shared their quietest moments of resolve. Tiana was busy taking photos of the house, capturing it from every angle as a way of marking their experience. Cameron clutched his toy truck, casting a last look around the rooms he had made his temporary playground. For him, it had been a place of games and adventures. Yet Michael knew that Cameron had felt the weight of the situation too. In his own young way, as they loaded the car, Michael caught sight of David Freeman's car pulling into the driveway. He stepped out, his expression warm but purposeful. As he approached the family, "Heading out?" David asked, his gaze meeting Michael's with a look that conveyed more than words could. Michael nodded, extending a hand. "Yes, it's time." David shook his hand, giving him a firm pat on the shoulder. "I want you to know that what you did here mattered. More people saw it than you realize, and some of them are starting to speak up about things that have been ignored here for too long." A spark of surprise and hope lit Michael's face. "Others?" David nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You showed people what courage looks like. Michael, that has an impact. The town council has started discussing some of the complaints they've brushed aside, and the police department is now under closer scrutiny. Your family helped make that happen." Michael felt a wave of gratitude, mixed with pride. He had come here with his family for peace, and though they'd faced struggle, they were leaving with a sense of purpose and legacy. "Thank you, David, for standing by us. I don't know what we would have done without you." David shrugged, his voice warm. "No thanks needed. You all deserve to live in a world that treats you with respect. This is just one step in making sure that world becomes a reality." As David turned to leave, he glanced at Tiana, who was watching him thoughtfully. "Tiana, you've got a brave spirit. Keep speaking up. People need voices like yours." Tiana's eyes sparkled with pride, and she gave him a small nod, a promise reflected in her gaze. She had felt the impact of their stand in a way that would stay with her, a newfound resolve that had taken root. With final goodbyes exchanged, the family climbed into the car, and Michael started the engine. As they drove away from the little house, Michael felt a sense of peace settle over him, a calm he hadn't felt since they'd arrived. The road stretched before them, winding away from the coastal town that had tested and shaped them in ways they hadn't expected. As they drove, Tiana turned in her seat to look back, watching the town fade into the distance. "Do you think they'll really make changes, Dad?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and skepticism. Michael glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression thoughtful. "I hope so, Tiana. Real change takes time, but I believe we've planted a seed. People have seen what it means to stand up for what's right. Maybe they'll be inspired to do the same." Abby placed a reassuring hand on Tiana's shoulder. "And even if it takes time, we did what we could. We showed them that we won't be silenced. And sometimes, that's enough to start a movement." Tiana nodded, her gaze softening as she looked out at the passing trees, the coastline dipping in and out of view. Cameron had drifted off to sleep, his head resting against the car window, blissfully unaware of the significance of their departure. But Michael knew this experience would stay with Tiana, and with all of them, as a powerful lesson in resilience. After a long drive, they arrived home, the familiarity of their house and neighborhood a welcome sight. As they unpacked, each of them seemed to settle back into the rhythm of their lives with a new perspective, carrying a sense of strength they hadn't possessed before. The following days brought a slow return to normalcy. Cameron shared stories of his big adventure at school, unaware of the gravity of what they'd faced. But Tiana, now more observant than ever, noticed small acts of prejudice around her, moments she hadn't seen before. She made a point to stand up, to question, to defend. Her courage, born in the quiet resistance they had shown as a family, began to shape her in ways that brought quiet pride to Michael and Abby. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived in the mail from David's office. Inside was a letter detailing updates on the police department in the town, including the suspension of Officer Johnson and an official investigation into the department's conduct. The council had begun discussions on diversity training, and several residents had come forward with their own stories of unjust treatment. Reading the letter, Michael felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. At dinner that evening, he shared the news with Abby, Tiana, and Cameron, their expressions reflecting a mixture of pride and relief. Tiana looked at her father, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "You showed me what it means to stand up, Dad. I want to do that for people, to help them feel safe, like you did for us." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You're already doing that, Tiana, just by being brave and speaking up. You're making a difference." The family shared a quiet, reflective moment, each of them realizing that the experiences they'd faced together had left an indelible mark on them. They'd come through a storm, stronger and more united, with a deeper understanding of resilience and justice. Months later, Michael received another letter, this time an invitation to speak at a community event back in the town. The organizers hoped his story would inspire others to stand up for change and encourage the town's leaders to continue addressing prejudice and fostering inclusivity. Michael shared the invitation with Abby, and together, they decided to attend. When the day of the event arrived, the entire family traveled back to the coastal town. As they drove through the streets, familiar but somehow changed, they saw a few familiar faces, some of whom nodded in respect as they passed. A quiet acknowledgement of what the Evans family had done. At the event, Michael stood before a packed room, Abby, Tiana, and Cameron watching from the front row. He spoke from the heart, recounting their experiences, the struggles they faced, and the importance of standing together against prejudice. He emphasized the power of community, of holding each other accountable, and of creating a town where every family, every child, could feel safe and welcome. As he finished, The room erupted in applause, some members of the audience visibly moved, others nodding in agreement. Michael stepped down from the stage, greeted by people thanking him, shaking his hand, and sharing stories of how his family's strength had inspired them. As they drove away from the town once again, Tiana leaned forward from the back seat, her voice steady but filled with hope. "Do you think they'll remember this, Dad?" Michael smiled, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes, Tiana, I think they will. We left something behind, a reminder that people are watching, and that change can happen when we stand up for what's right." As the Evans family drove home, the weight of their journey settled into a profound sense of accomplishment. They had faced fear, resisted prejudice, and emerged with a deeper understanding of their own strength and unity. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in warm hues, they knew they had left a legacy of courage and hope that would resonate far beyond the borders of that little town. Several months had passed since the Evans family's impactful visit to the coastal town, and life had returned to its usual rhythms. Yet, the experience lingered within each of them, shaping their perspectives, conversations, and the paths they began to consider for their futures. For Michael, the events in the town had renewed his dedication to fighting for justice. But now, he felt a personal urgency, a commitment not just to his clients, but to his family and the generations coming after. One evening, Michael returned home from his law office to find Tiana at the dining table. Her school books spread out before her and her face etched with deep concentration. She was reading something intently, taking notes with a steady determination that caught his attention. He could see from her expression that her mind was at work, processing, analyzing, and perhaps even making decisions she had yet to share. "Hard at work?" he asked, setting his briefcase down and taking a seat across from her. Tiana looked up, giving him a quick, thoughtful smile. "Yeah, I guess so. I'm working on an essay for school, but it's different this time." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the paper in front of her. "It's about justice and why it matters, and I think I want to do more with it." Michael felt a spark of pride and curiosity. "Tell me more. What do you mean by do more with it?" She took a deep breath, her words tumbling out as if she'd been waiting to say them for days. "I want to do what you do, Dad. I want to help people, make them feel safe and empowered, like you did for us in the town." Her eyes met his, earnest and full of purpose. "I want to become a lawyer and stand up for people who feel they don't have a voice." A wave of emotion washed over Michael, and he smiled, reaching across the table to place a hand over hers. "Tiana, you already have the heart and courage it takes to make a difference. Law or no law, you have the power to stand up for others. But if you want to become a lawyer, if you want to fight for justice, I'll be right beside you, supporting you every step of the way." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by Abby's voice calling from the kitchen. "Dinner's ready. Let's eat while it's hot." As they gathered around the table, sharing stories from their day, Michael couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. His family's journey had not only strengthened them as individuals, but had also brought them closer as a unit. He shared Tiana's words with Abby after dinner, who listened with tears in her eyes, overwhelmed with pride for her daughter. That night, as the house grew quiet, Michael found himself unable to sleep. He stepped onto the back porch, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. He reflected on the past months and felt a strong desire to expand his work, to use his experience not only to help individual clients but to foster lasting change within communities. It was a shift he hadn't seen coming, but now felt undeniable. The following week, he made a decision. He would launch an outreach program specifically targeting smaller towns with limited resources for legal advocacy and community support. He wanted to bring information and legal support to communities where individuals often felt intimidated by the system, places where families like his could face prejudice without the resources or support to fight back. It would be a long-term project, requiring time, funds, and a dedicated team, but he felt ready for the challenge. One evening, He shared his plan with Abby and the kids, explaining the purpose and scope of what he hoped to accomplish. Abby's face lit up with pride, and she immediately offered her support, brainstorming ways they could involve local leaders and grassroots organizations to strengthen the program. Tiana was equally enthusiastic, asking questions and offering ideas of her own. "Can I be part of it, too?" she asked, her eyes shining. "I could help with research, maybe even work with people one-on-one." "Absolutely," Michael replied, beaming. "This will be a family effort, and your insights will be invaluable." With the family's support, Michael threw himself into the project. He contacted David Freeman, who was more than willing to collaborate and share resources. David offered advice on navigating local politics and even volunteered to help with training workshops on civil rights, a crucial component of the outreach program. Together, they organized events, bringing in guest speakers, legal professionals, and community leaders to provide education on topics like legal rights, anti-discrimination laws, and how to report instances of injustice. The program quickly gained traction, with communities across the state reaching out, eager for the support and knowledge it provided. Michael's heart swelled each time he heard someone express gratitude for the work they were doing, knowing that he was helping to bridge a gap that had left so many vulnerable. Meanwhile, Tiana took an active role in the outreach, often accompanying her father to events. She began organizing her own youth workshops, inspiring her peers to be vigilant about their rights and to stand up for themselves and others. Her passion and confidence grew with every encounter, and she quickly became a young voice of leadership and resilience. Abby, too, became an integral part of the program, drawing on her skills as a therapist to offer workshops focused on managing stress, fostering resilience, and understanding the psychological impact of prejudice. Her workshops became a cornerstone of the program, helping community members find inner strength and empowering them to respond to challenges with dignity and courage. One particular event stood out in Michael's mind: a town hall in a community not far from the coastal town where their journey had begun. He had just finished a presentation on civil rights when a young woman approached him, her voice filled with gratitude. "Mr. Evans," she said, her eyes bright with emotion, "I can't thank you enough. I used to feel powerless. But seeing your family stand up and hearing your story, it's changed everything for me." Michael shook her hand, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "Thank you," he replied, humbled. "This is why we're here, to make sure no one feels powerless." The outreach program continued to grow, eventually expanding into a nonprofit organization with dedicated volunteers and legal professionals across the state. Michael, Abby, and Tiana poured their hearts into the work, each of them finding a unique way to contribute. The program's reputation spread, attracting attention from other legal advocates and even gaining the support of influential civil rights organizations. Years later, Michael looked back on those early days with gratitude. The journey his family had taken to the coastal town had been a catalyst for change, sparking not only growth in their own lives but also a ripple effect that had touched countless others. What had started as a simple family vacation had transformed into a movement, one rooted in unity, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As he watched Tiana graduate law school, her face radiating confidence and determination, he knew that the legacy they'd built would carry forward for generations. And as he stood beside Abby and Cameron, applauding their daughter's accomplishments, Michael realized that the strength and courage they had found together as a family would forever be the foundation of their lives. Through their journey, the Evans family had not only changed themselves, they had left an indelible mark on the world around them, proving that even the smallest acts of resistance, rooted in love and resilience, could light the way forward for others.